Alexander the Great and the birth of Hellenism. Alexander the Great comes out of a series of conflicts that took place focused on the Greeks in the 4th and 3rd century BCE. And those 5th century BCE, and then further on in the future. And those conflicts sort of lay the groundwork for Alexander to rise up and gain the power that he does. First of all was the Greek-Persian Wars, and those were the wars where the Persian, at that point in time, the largest empire in the world, invaded as part of its expansion. They're expanding to the west, and they run into Greece, they invade, and the Greeks are able to make an alliance with the Greek city-states, the Pole, and win victory over the Persians in a great triumph. However, once the Persians left, the Greeks start fighting each other. And so basically the Athenians claim to be the leaders, the Spartans claim to be the leaders. In that victory of 467, the Athenians claim that it was their navy that turned the tide. The Spartans claim it was their soldiers that turned the tide. And the Athenians end up taking a leadership role over the various Greek pole, but the Spartans resent that fiercely. And so the Greeks, the Athenians and the Spartans go to war, and basically a Greek civil war between the pole. And it's an extremely brutal war, 461 to 451, 431 to 404. So if you look at those numbers, think of those in terms of someone who could grow up seeing pretty much their entire life, seeing these city-states at war with each other. They're brutal wars. They're wars in which people are constantly shifting alliances, betraying allies, finding new enemies, back and forth. And the end result of it is that everybody ends up weak. That all of the Greek city-states are left weakened by the war, regardless of who was officially a victor or not. And into that, we have the rise of Alexander. And this is a sculpture of him. The fact of the matter is we don't actually have any contemporary sculptures of him. This is what somebody thought he must have looked like. Where Alexander comes out of is Macedonia, which actually should be shown here with a capital M. And if you look at the map, it's that little area at the top, the little green area, and it's actually a kingdom, and it's not really part of the city-states of Greece. They see themselves as Greeks. They pride themselves on that. They're very into it. But the Greeks themselves look over at them and say, that's just a bunch of horseback riding, backcountry barbarians, basically. You know, they're not Greeks. They don't really count as part of our society. So there's a bit of an inferiority complex, perhaps, going on here for the Macedonians. Alexander's father is the one who really begins this whole process that Alexander is going to conclude with such great success. And he does this by, first of all, conquering and unifying Macedonia. Some of it's done with fighting, but a lot of it's actually done through making marriage alliances. He had a lot of wives over time and trying to make connections that will support him and his ambitions. With unified Macedonia, he builds up a professional full-time army. So remember, Greek city-states, you fight until it's time to go farm, and then you go back and you farm, and then it's time to fight again after you collect your harvest. But these guys from Macedonia, this is what they do. They fight. That's their full-time job. That's how they're trained. And they're trained to fight together. And in fact, Philip adopts new and adapts old tactics. And he does a variety of things. One of the most striking is actually what you're seeing in that picture there of those very long spears. He substitutes the previous spears that people have been using in the fighting. I don't know if you remember the hoplites, the Greek fighters who you march into war in the Greek style with a shield in front of you, but half the shield is protecting your neighbor and half of your neighbor on the other side's shield is protecting you. And so you sort of all depend on each other to keep you all protected as you march into battle. Well, one of the ways in which the Macedonians improve on this model is by creating these extremely long spears, which you're seeing in those pictures. And that allows you to have contact with the enemy way before they actually come into possible contact with you. They also include cavalry, pike warfare, a whole variety of methods. And by 338 BCE, Philip has conquered the Greek city-states. Alexander was the son of Olympias and Philip, so he's legitimate heir of Philip. He's his son and expected to inherit probably. There's, various legends about how Olympias raised Alexander. Supposedly, according to some of these legends, she told Alexander that he was a god, or the son of a god, that he had a great and amazing destiny, that his father really wasn't Philip, but the god that had come to her bed disguised as Philip when she became pregnant. It seems pretty clear that Olympias was a strong-willed woman with a good knowledge of politics, because she took some very strong action long-term against some of her competition, including Philip's other wives. He grew up with this assumption that he was going to fight wars and he was going to have this great destiny from his fighting and his conquering. His relationship with Philip really didn't get along so great. It's not much fun when you're still a reasonably youngish king. I mean, you're middle-aged, late middle-aged, but still, you're not that old. And you have this young son who is pretty much ready to take over. And so there's a lot of back and forth where Philip will look at his accomplishments, and he looks at his accomplishments and he thinks maybe Alexander's just gearing up to take the throne from him. So there's a lot of give and take there, not very pleasant. In 336 BCE, Philip is assassinated, and there's always been accusations that Olympias and Alexander were behind it. According to one biography, he was killed by an ex-lover. But regardless, that doesn't eliminate the possibility that whoever actually killed him was being paid or being supported in some way by Alexander and Olympias. Regardless, once he's assassinated, Alexander takes power. And he quickly consolidates his control. He gets rid of all of the rivals and rebellions in Macedonia. If you thought you were going to sort of kick up your heels, make a break for freedom as soon as Philip is dead, Alexander made it very clear that that was not a possibility. In the case of the Greek city-states, the city-state of Thebes had actually rebelled against Macedonian authority, and he goes in, he ends that revolt, he conquers them, and he does it so thoroughly that at the end of this, there's 6,000 dead Thebans and 30,000 slaves who have been captured in the battle and sent off to be sold into slavery. Having basically gotten his military into line, consolidated his power in the areas that his father had already conquered, Alexander sets off on his great ambition to conquer the world, or the known world. And he does that by invading Persia. He also claimed that he was doing this to punish Persia, the Persian Empire, for its earlier invasions of Greece. If you look at the lines of the map, you'll see Alexander's route. You'll notice that he goes down, spends some time in Egypt, in addition to traveling sort of back. There's a lot of backing and forth thing as he goes across through the Persian Empire. There's various comments, at least at the time, people accused Alexander of, when he went to Egypt, being greeted by the priests there as a god, or the son of a god, and given a sort of an elevated opinion of himself, or at least that's what his detractors said. But as you can see, how far their armies managed to go it's pretty impressive, particularly when you realize that army is moving on its feet for the most part. So Alexander and his troops, they conquer the Persian Empire. They build cities and monuments, and Alexander loved to name things, in some cases after himself. So Alexandria in Egypt and a variety of other cities are named some version of Alexander. But he also named places after his best friend who died, after his horse and his dog, all of which he was very fond of. Alexander has growing numbers of problems. First of all, he's torn between the Persians and the Macedonians. The Persians have a very elevated concept of what it means to be king or emperor, and they expect Alexander to take that on, which would mean not touching, people who want to speak to you, having to come and bow deeply, all this kind of very stately respect protocols that they're supposed to follow. Macedonians have very different expectations of their king. They basically expect him to be the best warrior, but also someone who can go and get drunk with them and hang out with them and banquet with them and feast with them. And that's pretty much the opposite of what the Persians expect. And so he keeps getting accusations from both sides that he's not doing it right, that he should be moving more towards one side or the other. The Macedonians also tend to accuse him of thinking that he's an actual god, and there's no real evidence that that's the case necessarily, but it was certainly an accusation that has got thrown at him a great deal. A major turning point in all of this is in India in 326 BCE, and the story goes that Alexander leading his troops, they get all the way to the Indus River, and they sit down for a rest, basically, or they're waiting for a rest, and Alexander's saying, let's figure out how to get across the river, let's keep going, there's new lands to conquer on the other side. And his army said, no. We have been on this invasion force for a very long time. We're tired, we're done, we want to see our families, or we want to go find somewhere to settle down. We don't want to keep on with this. And the story is that Alexander at that point, when his army refused to go any further, sat down and he cried because he no longer had any worlds to conquer. And after that, he seems to have given in to bouts of drunkenness, despair, and he eventually ends up dead, 323 BCE. He left behind a wife and son who don't survive the 2 years to follow, because everybody is trying to make a claim on the territory that Alexander left conquered. What replaces Alexander is the Hellenistic kingdoms, and what's really important about them is the cultural and social situation that they set up. The generals go ahead and split the empire. Seleucids get Western Asia, the Ptolemaics get Egypt. Cleopatra is someone you might have heard of. She was a Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt. And the Antagonids get Macedonia. And those are the 3 chunks of empire. The Hellenistic kingdoms that are set up, they sponsor private and public art and purchase luxuries. They build public temples and other kinds of public buildings. And what you're looking at there is a museum exhibit of a public building that has been taken down and brought to a museum to display so people can actually see it. They built museums, they built libraries, sort of did everything they could to make the class more interesting and a more supportive environment for learning. What did I just say? Okay, pardon me for that slight detour. I was looking at the wrong notes. Okay, so they basically did do what they could to make their main cities, their kingdoms more interesting, more supportive. And you actually, if you look at sort of the greatest collections of learning, one of the ones in the ancient world was at the library at the city of Alexandria, which was a place where a huge amount of texts were found. Supposedly the library, by the way, was famous for refusing to give things back. So if they sort of wrote to you and said, we really would like to have a copy of a book, we know you own the scroll, if you sent them the scroll, what they would often do is they would copy the scroll and they'd send you the copy and keep the original. So you had to be clever to get away from them. Hellenism. Hellenism is sort of the cultural movement that goes along with this. And it consists of a mixture of things. It consists of a mixture of Greek language, Greek culture, Greek ways of life, but mixed with local practices, local beliefs, local ways of life, and sort of a blending being created of the two of those things. Okay, and it's not just a one-way street. This is possible because the kingdoms improve travel and communication. They make it a lot easier to travel between the kingdoms freely. You have greater ethnic diversity in the various kingdoms because of this travel, because of the flexibility of it. And that, by the way, is a Greek statue of an African child, young man at least, that you're looking at there, right, as sort of an example of the ethnic diversity that developed. They encourage strongly trade. They make it possible to exchange letters easily and exchange ideas and thoughts. And they use Greek as a common language to bind them together. So you have the spread of the Greek language and culture. You have the spread of Greek institutions like the gymnasiums, the symposiums, etc. You have Greek mythologies and gods, and you have the spread of philosophies and big ideas. These ideas and practices spread from the conquered lands as well. And so mystery religions like Isis, Mithra, which was sort of built on Zoroastrianism, various kinds of religious movements actually flow into Greek-held lands from outside. So it's not just the Greek ideas going out, it's other kinds of ideas coming back in exchange, including scientific and philosophical ideas, customs, and culture. And that's actually a statue of Isis. Worship of Isis as an Egyptian goddess was one of the more popular mystery religions, new religions that spread in these lands. The result was a cultural fusion, blending Greek and local and Persian with religions and deities that are spreading and adapting, intermarriage between the two groups, and a scientific blossoming. If you actually look at the work that gets done that we talk about when we talk about ancient Greek science, most of it is work that was actually done during the Hellenistic period because of this cultural fusion that we're talking about.